Hi, welcome back to Kennings Cantrips. I'm Russ.
And I'm Morgan, and we are back in episode 2.3 about story pacing with Hans Schantz and David J. West.
In this part, we're going to be talking particularly about tropes, genre tropes, story tropes, and everything in general to do with tropes. So moving on to a slightly different aspect of the topic, we have a bunch of writers in some different genres here. So here's a good point to talk about. What are some tropes that you think are common to your genre that are really important in your particular genre? And possibly what do you think are maybe overdone in your genre? And what have you done personally where you've kind of played with some of those or really stuck to one or really changed one up? Whoever wants to go first.
Well, I'll take a stab at it. In my first novel, The Hidden Truth, my story is set in a small town in eastern Tennessee, and I really didn't want to spend lots of time with detailed description of the setting or the characters or how people looked or anything like that. So I tried to lean as much as possible on some common tropes. So for instance, we have a kind of idealized mother and father character. There is a character who's the sheriff, who seems to be in the pocket of the local important people. I went ahead and I started my story from those tropes so that you could very quickly say, okay, well, there's the corrupt Southern sheriff, and there's super mom and super dad, and we can go on from there with the story. And that was enough to get me started. And then over the course of the story, you learn that appearances aren't quite what they seem. And a large part of the story is the puzzle of how that works out and what mom and dad's backstory is, what the sheriff's backstory is, and where they really stand on some of the issues that are coming up in the novel. So I found it as a beginning novelist trying to begin a novel, leaning on those tropes was very helpful to me. And then it also made it interesting because as the tropes started to be subverted, the reader is interested to find out the ways in which those people aren't what they seem to be.
Good. Yeah, that sounds really interesting. How about you, David?
I probably don't follow tropes as much as I should. I've been doing some weird Westerns, and I don't know how much the Western reader crowd has really cared for those. I mean, I've been selling them okay, but, had my rough and tough character, but I don't know if I have him right off into the sunset quite, because he kind of has his pack of friends that are with him, so it's not quite to the sunset. Been kind of eschewing having any romance, which seems like it could help, but I haven't really bothered with it. When it comes to fantasy, I gotta have my sword and sorcery types. I love the Conan, Solomon Kane, those types, so I like having the strong, aggressive, proactive hero. I kind of resent when people think barbarians are stupid.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in proactive heroes as well. And
definitely proactive. I'm not as into the magic. I'd probably look at them more as antagonists. But if you're gonna have magic in the fantasy, to me, it's gotta have cost, sacrifice for using it. I mean, I can enjoy the Harry Potter movies with my kids or something, but for me, I could never write that because you can't just wave a wand and stuff happens. You have to prepare something. I think there's plenty of tropes that are valuable, but I kind of just go from my gut. So I'm probably not a great person to talk about tropes.
No, I thought that was some good stuff, and actually, it's interesting because in the urban fantasy world, I found your comments about magic especially interesting. It's not uncommon for magic to have some kind of cost, but that's an area in the urban fantasy world where I definitely played with the tropes myself, and will be doing much more of that in future books. The modern trend in fantasy in general, but especially in urban fantasy, is toward a very syncretic view of magic. It's there tends to be a lot of synthesis of all kinds of different cultural views. We'll steal a little bit from here and a little bit from there, and to mock it a little bit more than I really mean to. It's a little bit of the, oh, hey, look, everybody's view is valid kind of mentality. And I don't quite mean that as harshly as it sounds, because I enjoy some of it, especially when it's done really well. But that's become kind of the modern approach to it. In my own approach, I took a very old school kind of way back to, the example I use a lot is Dracula, although otherwise it's not very much like my book at all. But in a way, that's one of the first urban fantasy books I can think of. And, but it's a book that took the metaphysics behind the book is a very Christian metaphysics, and not explicitly. It's not like he's out there as a Bible thumper. It's just the worldview that he took for granted.
Yeah.
When he wrote the book. And I've gone back to that myself to mess with the trope on purpose. It's a purposeful deviation from the trope. But one of the things that comes with that really appealed to me is what you say about magic coming with the cost, because the Christian point of view on magic is that magic is always and everywhere bad. Even if you're trying to do good things with it, it is inherently corrupting and inherently sinful and damaging. And playing with that, more than trying to proselytize to anybody, which isn't really the purpose, it gives you a lot of opportunity for bad things to happen. And that, in my experience, is a lot of where story and drama really comes from.
Yeah.
And so, I'm very much with you on the magic having a cost thing. One of the other big tropes that I played with myself, intentionally subverted a trope, is the big thing overwhelmingly in urban fantasy right now is a first-person perspective where the main character is narrating the story and talking about it all. And that's super common in that genre. And I deliberately went third person to stand out a little bit from that, just to be different. We'll see how well that works out as a choice. It may have been a poor one, but it was a deliberate one from there. So I definitely agree with you that following tropes too closely can be bad as well. And like I said, I made a deliberate attempt to take a couple and really just completely violate them entirely.
I feel like story trumps everything, and if people enjoy it enough, you can mess with all the tropes.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. And one of the biggest things that I really feel like is that ultimately we're in the entertainment business. And so the real goal is just to keep the reader entertained. And if you achieve that, then you can get away with almost anything. My personal favorite example of that is the first Avengers film. I love the film. Everybody loves the film, right? It made a huge amount of money. Tons of people went to see it. I can't think of anybody I know who actually dislikes the film. But when you stop and think about that film, when you really start to think about the plot, it is riddled with plot holes. Like, the whole thing crumbles when you start to think about it. And you don't care because you're having so much fun watching the movie that you just don't care when you're watching it.
Well, I was going to add that one of the reason tropes become tropes is because they do tend to be very effective storytelling frameworks. One trope I hadn't really realized I'd gotten myself into is, there are some classic character combinations that tend to work really well in a story. One of the simplest is what's called a Freudian trio of a super ego, and id, or the rational on one side, the emotional on the other side, and then the main character having to steer a course between them in the middle. That's
Kirk Spock McCoy.
Exactly. I was about to say the same thing.
And I found that I was doing that that my storytelling ended up falling into that kind of pattern between my young high school hero, his high school friend who's inexperienced but hyper-rationalistic and reads a lot and very logical. And then his uncle on the other side, who's the mature adult guardian. And it just made for some excellent opportunities to have conflict between the heroes, which many times is actually more entertaining than the heroes fighting the villain. If you have good versus good mixed in with your good versus evil conflict. So
absolutely,
a lot of those tropes are very powerful storytelling techniques.
How many of you guys read comic books as a kid?
Me. Still do.
So you remember when you're a kid and you're reading comic books and you see the team up comics, your favorite characters are getting together, but you're always most excited about when they fight each other, right? That's almost more fun than watching them fight the villains, is when your favorite heroes are out there duking it out with each other and going. That's Hans, you're definitely onto something with that. The hero versus hero has its own entertainment value for sure.
Oh, when you can come up with a plausible way for Superman and Batman to be on opposite sides, or you were bringing up the Avengers Civil War did a really nice job of taking the heroes and splitting them in half and setting up a conflict between them.
Absolutely.
And that made that a very effective and very good movie.
Yeah. When you mentioned your trio, I realized that that's what I've been doing with my Weird Westerns, even though I wasn't thinking about it, was having the trio of Porter, the main tough guy hero, and then they've got Roxy, who's with them, who's kind of on the run. She's a little more emotional, but still has interesting skills. And then I have another guy, Quincy, who's a former Buffalo soldier, and there's kind of a strange triangle of opinions in that. And so I guess I was doing it without planning on doing it.
Well, I stumbled into it myself. I started reading up on tropes as part of my trying to educate myself on more sophisticated storytelling techniques. And I realized that I was somewhere between a Freudian trio for my main characters and actually what's called a 5-man band, which is a little more complicated set of characters where you have the leader, the lancer, the tough guy, the smart guy, and colloquially the chick who provides some emotional impetus to the group. And that technique works very well, like the A-Team, for instance.
Yeah.
One of the classic examples of that kind of storytelling trope. And that also provides lots of opportunities for interchange and interaction between the characters to advance the plot.
Yeah, I followed one. There's probably a name for it better than what I know, because I didn't research it heavily. It's a relationship I recognized from other sources. But I followed one fairly deliberately in my first novel of the example I'll use is Superman and Batman, the character foils, where in a lot of ways they're very similar, right? They're both heroic characters who have a lot of the same kinds of goals. They're out for many similar objectives, but the way they approach those things is so different that what you get when you put them together is you get much more interesting character out of both of them than you ever get when they're apart, because they kind of, by being different from each other, they kind of emphasize each other's character a bit more. The lightness of Superman kind of emphasizes the darkness of Batman and vice versa. And it helps bring them out. And so I did that a little bit deliberately with they're not quite co-protagonists in my story. There's one really truly main character, but the secondary character is almost a main character. He's a pretty major player in the story. And as I've been plotting out the sequels, I've been thinking more and more, like originally the next 2 books in the series, the secondary character was not intended to be in them anywhere near as much as now that I'm in the outlines. I'm like, no, I really need more of him because of that foil effect. He needs to be there to help with that. And so that you're absolutely right in what you said a good while back, Hans, that you get into those tropes because they work. and they achieve what you're trying to do.
That's it for genre tropes, and this is the end of 2.3. We will be back soon in 2.4, where we'll talk about the ebook revolution and whether that's making a big difference in story pacing and how people craft their books.